Well, hello world. This must be Thursday, August 13th of 2020. Welcome back to Prepping Today. Thanks for being here. I'm your host, Prepper Jay. Let's get this show underway. There's been a lot of great and useful information online about radio. Today I'm here to help you learn about your radio communications and how you can use them to maximize your capabilities both before and after disaster strikes. The information online that I have found, though, doesn't quite go very deep or very broad, and today I want to do both. I want to give you a big head start to understand how radio actually works and the best ways to incorporate it into your preparations. First, I'll go over some of the very basics about the physics of radio, but I'll try to keep it simple and not too technical. Just a bit of background information will help to make everything else fit together and make more sense for you. I'll be talking about receiving all kinds of radio signals with standard AM and FM radios, as well as weather radios, crystal radios, and shortwave world band receivers. Then we'll look at how you can communicate with CB radios, two-way walkie-talkies, and amateur radio or ham radio. We'll also look at the cutting edge with software-defined radio or SDR. After that, we'll go over some of the things to think about regarding safety and security, and we'll close out with this week's news and, of course, the gear and book recommendations. Of course, we can also talk about anything else prepping related, or I can try to answer any questions you have if you'd like to bring it up in the live chat, or send me a message on Twitter at prepping_today. So, stay tuned. Who do we have here right now? Just getting going. Okay. All right. Now, let's set the stage here. While disasters can strike suddenly and catch everyone off guard, there are also many scenarios where there will be at least some degree of warning. There's a good chance that at some point in your life you may have been watching television or listening to music on the radio when the emergency alert system cut in with a screech or a tone. It was probably only a test, but it may have been actually announcing a real emergency, and you would have received instructions on how to respond. Or you may have been going about your day as usual when you suddenly hear a loud warning siren. Again, this was most likely only a regularly scheduled test, but if it were an actual emergency, you'd probably be turning your television to a local news channel or tuning into your favorite radio station to hear what's going on. These days, you might also get alerts on your cell phone. You might have been in Hawaii on January 13th of 2018, having your morning cup of coffee when your cell phone lit up with an emergency alert in all capital letters saying, quote, "Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill," end quote. At the same time, the television and radio stations all chimed in with the same warning, and the sirens all started going off as well. Fortunately, of course, this incident turned out to be a false alarm. Still, it's nice to have these warning systems in place. Having even a small chance to take action before disaster strikes can make the difference between life and death. How are we looking here? We are rolling. Good, good. Now, with regard to early warning, there are a variety of devices you can use to make sure you get the best information as early as you can, so you can make the best decisions as the situation demands. Of course, the classic device is a commercial radio receiver. These can tune into the AM or FM band or both. When the emergency alert system activates, regular station programming is interrupted to pass on important information. The same is true for broadcast television stations. However, there is a lot more to radio than just the AM and FM bands. Over-the-air television is actually transmitted by radio as well, but additionally, a weather radio receives signals from its own special band. The details vary from country to country, but in general, these dedicated radio stations broadcast weather information 24 hours a day, usually current conditions and forecasts, but they also issue alerts during severe weather and even for non-weather related emergencies. Modern weather radio systems feature a special type of signal that can remotely trigger your receiver to activate in the event of an emergency. This way, you can keep your radio powered on but silent, waiting and listening while you go about your life, and when it receives that emergency signal, it will automatically sound its alarm to alert you. This is especially handy if you're in a location where warning sirens are too distant to be heard clearly, particularly when you have your windows closed. We actually got our weather radio after the second time we realized we couldn't hear the sirens going off for a tornado warning. So they come in handy. How are we looking here? Good, good. Now, before we get too far into the weeds on all of your radio options, I want to give you a quick overview of how radio works, so you have a bit of a framework to help everything make more sense. I'm going to oversimplify quite a bit here, but if this kind of thing catches your interest, I can recommend plenty of resources to learn more. The first thing to know about is the electromagnetic field. You can think of it kind of like the Force in the Star Wars movies. Electromagnetism is actually a fundamental force of nature in real life. This field is everywhere across the universe in every direction. It's in the ground beneath your feet, and it's inside you. Both electricity and magnetism are manifestations of this force, and we can use electricity and magnetism to exert influence on it. We can use the force to affect things far away from us. Another useful analogy is the surface of a busy swimming pool. You've got waves of all different sizes, some big waves sloshing up and down slowly as they cross from one end of the pool to the other, while you have smaller waves rippling around as well, passing through each other and interfering with one another. If you were to sit at one spot in the pool, and you had something like a floating ball on a string that would bob up and down as the waves passed by, you could count how many times the ball went up and down each second, and you could measure whether it went up and down only a little or a whole lot. You'd probably have a mixture of some big movements and some little movements as the big waves and little waves coming from all different directions all passed by your floating ball. You could also use the string to plunge the ball into the water to cause new ripples to go out into the rest of the pool. If you tugged just a little, you'd get little waves, and if you tugged harder, you'd get big waves. This is essentially exactly how radio works. The electromagnetic field is just like the surface of the pool, and it has waves of all sizes rippling through it in all directions. We can use simple materials arranged in a clever way to detect those waves, and measure how big they are and how frequent they are. We can also use clever devices to spread waves of our own, and someone else with another device can detect those waves, and we can use this to send and receive information. All right. So, just a little bit more background on how radio works so you can understand three important terms. Thinking of the ball on the surface of the pool, remember how we could use it to count how many times it bounced up and down each second? That is to say, how frequently it bounced? We could call this the frequency of the wave that it was bouncing on. The unit of frequency is called hertz. That's H-E-R-T-Z. If the ball bounced 4 times in a second, we would say it was a 4 hertz wave, that it had a frequency of 4 hertz. Similarly, remember how we could measure whether the ball moved up and down just a little or a whole lot? This is called the amplitude of the wave. If the wave isn't very deep and it doesn't move the ball up and down very much, we say it has a low amplitude. On the other hand, if the ball moves up and down a lot, we say the wave has a high amplitude. One last term to know. Imagine you were able to freeze time, and then you took a tape measure to the pool and measured the distance from the top of one wave to the top of the next one. This is called the wavelength, and it's inversely related to the frequency. That is to say, the larger the wavelength, the lower the frequency. A smaller wavelength means a higher frequency. You can imagine this in how the waves would move, and it should become fairly intuitive. If the top of the waves are farther apart from each other, it will take longer for them to move the ball up and down as they pass by. But if the waves are closer together, the ball will move up and down more quickly. I promise this is all important. Let's take a look at our chat here. Any questions so far? Feel free to let me know. Okay. So now, we've got the basic idea for the physics of how radio works. Why is any of that important? Well, for one thing, it gives us a way to organize our options. You see, there are many different kinds of radio. There's AM and FM commercial radio, and also satellite radio. There's broadcast and satellite television. I also mentioned weather radio. There's also a whole other range of radio you can listen to called shortwave, sometimes known as world band, because you can pick up stations from around the planet. There are also scanners you can use to listen in on police, fire, and emergency medical services, as well as local businesses. You can even hear the communications between airplanes and your local airport tower, or you can pick up an airplane's data transmission as it passes overhead. There's also Citizens Band or CB radio, which used to be popular with commercial truckers and still is to some degree. Of course, there are walkie-talkie two-way radios, which you might have played with as a child or taken with you on camping trips. And you may have heard of amateur radio or ham radio, even if you're not quite familiar with exactly what it is or how it works. To keep all of these from becoming a useless, jumbled mess of noise, government regulations assign each type of service its own range of frequencies. You can think of all of radio as being a sort of rainbow, because really that's exactly what it is. It's a spectrum running from low frequencies to higher frequencies, and all the different services have their own little chunk called a band. For example, the commercial AM band is roughly centered around 1000 kilohertz. Now, 1 kilohertz means 1000 hertz, so 1000 kilohertz means 1 million hertz. 1 million hertz is also called 1 megahertz. Oh, what do we got here? Possible technical issue, bear with me. Looks like we are still streaming to YouTube. Twitch dropped out momentarily though. Okay, but it looks like Twitch is back. Sorry about that. So, 1 million hertz is also called 1 megahertz. If you listen to a station called something like AM 1540, that means the station is broadcasting at a frequency of 1540 kilohertz, which is to say 1,540,000 hertz. The commercial FM band is around 100 megahertz. If you listen to an FM station called something like 101.7, that means the station is broadcasting at a frequency of 101.7 megahertz, which is to say 101,700,000 hertz. Understanding how these frequencies are organized can help us sort out and keep track of how all the different radio services fit together. So this is looking good then? Okay, yeah, we're looking good. Sorry about that again. Now, ready to move on to some actual gear? Let's get to some actual gear. Suppose I offered you a radio receiver, and I told you it was special, because this kind of receiver can work without any power. No batteries necessary. Doesn't even need to be plugged in. It just works. Sounds perfect for off-grid, right? Now suppose I told you, I don't need to give you one of these magic radios, because you can make one yourself quickly and easily for dirt cheap using mostly junk you already have. Of course, you might already know what I'm talking about. This is a real thing. It's called a crystal radio. It's a popular do-it-yourself project for beginners in electronics. There are many variations on the basic design, but it's fundamentally about as simple as you can get. The key part is a special type of diode, which is like a one-way valve for electricity. This diode was historically made from a lump of natural lead called galena, touched very lightly in just the right spot by a wire called a cat's whisker. A variation called a foxhole radio was improvised by soldiers during World War II. They would burn a razor blade to oxidize it, or use one that had rusted, and this would substitute for the lump of galena. They would then make a cat's whisker using a safety pin or a pencil. Modern designs use a manufactured diode made of germanium. These are called 1N34 or 1N34A diodes, and they're about the size of a grain of rice. The other important part of a crystal radio is a high impedance earpiece. Your regular headphones or earbuds won't work for this. You can make your own with a piezoelectric crystal, or you can make one of those out of Rochelle salt, but really you'll get much better results if you just buy one. They're only a few dollars. Your radio will also need an antenna to catch the radio signal from the air. Any wire can work as an antenna. In the early days of radio, farmers used their own fences as antennas. Generally, the longer the wire, the better, though if space is limited, you can use multiple wires going in the same direction, all coming together at your receiver. The very simplest crystal radio design involves inserting your diode between the antenna wire and a metal stake pounded into the ground. Antenna, diode, stake. You connect one wire from your earpiece before the diode and the other wire after the diode, and that's it. That's a complete radio receiver. However, this most basic design does not have a tuning circuit, so whatever you get is what you get. You can cut your antenna shorter and shorter to change the tuning, but of course that's less than ideal. A simple tuning circuit can be made with an inductor and a capacitor. An inductor is really just a coil of wire, and you can make a tunable capacitor with aluminum foil taped onto cardboard. There's a YouTube channel called rimstar.org that has some very excellent videos explaining how you can make a crystal radio built around a paper towel tube or inside a pizza box. I've made my own from his instructions and it works great. Rimstar.org. Check out his stuff. Seriously, it's great. If you have the means and you'd rather just buy a nice kit or even a finished crystal radio itself, you can find a wide variety online. There's actually one at United Nuclear that I want to buy someday. But just remember, it's definitely true you get what you pay for. Some cheaper vendors online selling so-called germanium diodes will actually send you a silicon Schottky diode instead. If you get your radio together and it doesn't work the way it should, this might be why. With the right parts and the right design, a crystal radio can pick up the entire commercial AM band. If you were tuning a regular AM radio and you got to the top of the band and then you were able to keep going, you'd get into shortwave, world band radio. Some crystal radio designs can actually do this. See how this all fits together? So with a good crystal radio, even without any power, if anyone's left to broadcast, even from far away, you'll be able to hear it. How are we looking here? Looking good on both sides. Twitter is good. Okay. Let's get our bearings for a moment and then we'll talk about shortwave. It's called shortwave because the wavelengths are shorter than those of standard commercial AM radio. Shortwave is also called HF, which stands for high frequency, because the frequencies are higher. Commercial AM radio actually lives in a region called medium wave or medium frequency. Below this, there is a region called long wave, which is strange and interesting in its own right, but honestly not much use from a prepping perspective, so we'll leave that one alone today. So we've got long wave, broadcast AM radio in medium wave, and now let's look at shortwave. Shortwave itself is really a broad spectrum, and the lower end of the band works quite a bit differently than the upper end. The lower end tends to work better at night, while the upper end is often best during the day. This is due to the influence of the sun on certain layers of the Earth's atmosphere. If you start tuning through the shortwave band, you'll find all kinds of interesting things. You'll hear news programs in foreign languages. You'll hear music. You'll hear religious evangelists and infomercials. You'll come across stations that beep once every second and then announce the official time each minute. You'll also hear quicker, more erratic beeping signals that you might recognize as Morse code. Other signals might sound like harsh, grinding computer noise. You'll find people talking back and forth to each other, and if you listen long enough, they might mention where they are, and you'll realize they're in different states or even countries, perhaps very far from you. These are amateur radio operators, also called ham radio operators. They occupy several different places along the shortwave spectrum and quite a bit more. We'll come back to ham radio in a bit. Citizens band, or CB radio, is actually in the upper end of shortwave. We'll talk about that too. If you're very lucky, and I mean very lucky these days, you might come across a strange broadcast of someone reciting a string of numbers with no explanation of what they mean. These are called number stations, and they're used to send secret coded messages to spies around the world. Technology has advanced, though, and these are much less common than they used to be. You can find many recordings of number stations online, though. They're very interesting and sometimes kind of creepy. Any questions so far? Or any points of discussion that anyone wants to bring up? No? Okay. Now, Having a good shortwave receiver can be a huge boon for your preparations. Not only do most of them also receive regular AM and FM radio, and sometimes also the weather band, or even more like air traffic control, they also open up a huge new range of potentially useful information. Whenever a large-scale disaster strikes, ham radio operators spring into action to relay emergency communications. You can listen in on these transmissions to hear what's going on as it happens. Also, if the media in your country is heavily restricted by the government or dominated by only a handful of powerful corporations, you can listen to news from other countries to get an outside perspective on current events. Of course, every country spins its own propaganda, so just keep that in mind when you listen. If you're in the market for a shortwave receiver, I would strongly recommend you get one that is capable of single sideband, or SSB. This is a special mode that the vast majority of ham radio operators use to make the most efficient use of their power and to take up less space in their band. There are two major kinds of SSB, called upper sideband and lower sideband. Above 10,000 kilohertz, it's traditional to use upper sideband, while below 10,000 kilohertz, it's most common to use lower sideband. This is not a universal rule, but if you're casting the net to see what you can catch, you should keep this in mind. Speaking of nets, ham radio operators hold scheduled meetings called nets on certain frequencies at scheduled times. These nets might be of general interest or they might have a specific purpose. For example, the American Readout Radio Operators Network, or AMRON, and the American Preparedness Radio Network, or TAPRN, are nationwide emergency communications networks specifically for preppers. They hold scheduled nets you can listen in on. These are certainly very interesting, and you could potentially learn from them, but be forewarned, they definitely have a strong political slant. One last thing about shortwave. A lot of receivers, especially the cheaper ones, are only designed to pick up certain parts of the shortwave band. They have a switch to change between these chunks, usually labeled something like SW1, SW2, and so on. From a prepping perspective, these receivers are certainly better than nothing, though for not much more money, I'd really recommend finding a model that can cover the entire shortwave band. Let's see, here we go. My personal favorite shortwave receiver is a Texon PL660. It receives regular AM and FM, as well as weather and air traffic, plus the entire shortwave band, and it can handle single sideband. It can actually receive long wave as well, but you'll probably want a much longer antenna for that. I'd recommend this receiver to anyone. Again, the Texon PL660. To be clear, I'm not being paid to say this, it's just my own opinion. And this isn't even the official gear recommendation for the week. We'll get to that at the end of the stream. There is, I should mention, a PL880, but I don't have that one, so I can't vouch for it. And when I was doing my research, there was some issue that made me hesitant on that one, and I opted for this one instead. I can't remember what that was, I'm sorry. Do your own research, but I can recommend the PL660 for sure. Alright, how are we looking here? What kind of price range is that? Okay, so you can find it on sale sometimes, especially like Cyber Monday, that kind of thing. Usually, for that particular model, you should be looking around $100 to $120, depending where you're getting it and when. I understand that's definitely on the pricier side. You can find cheaper shortwave radios that only do those chunks. Those might be around the $40 to $60 range. Like I say though, if you can, I strongly encourage you to make that extra investment, get the full thing, get all the capabilities. It's a great radio, seriously. Okay, what else? Anyone else? Good. All right. Now, during the recent protests in cities across the United States, especially those where vandalism and looting broke out, many people concerned for their safety were not content to limit their news intake to the regular news stations, which, even when operating live, were necessarily still delayed from the action. Also, some people were concerned about possible bias in coverage and didn't want to be kept in the dark. There have been numerous protesters and journalists who have presented live streams from within the protests, which anyone could watch online. Likewise, there are many audio streams online of public service radio systems. such as police, fire, and emergency medical services. Many people began listening to these streams as well. However, whether by accident or design, in the middle of all this action, many of those streams went down. The reality we have seen in many mass protests around the world is that the government can restrict access to specific online services, or even just shut off internet access or cell phone service entirely. When the police radio live streams went down, some people were still able to listen live because they had a type of radio receiver called a scanner. That is this one. A scanner is designed to scan through many different frequencies, stopping when it finds a signal. Often the range of frequencies the scanner can cover include public service radio systems, as well as the security and daily operation of local businesses, hospitals, universities, sports venues, taxi dispatch, and so on. Many scanners can also pick up signals from people nearby using two-way radios like walkie-talkies, CB, or ham radio. As radio technology has evolved over the years, scanners have evolved with them. Just as television broadcasts transitioned from an older style of analog signal to a newer type of digital signal, so too have many public and private radio systems, as well as the scanners themselves. This means that while you may find an old scanner at a thrift store or garage sale, it may only be able to understand the old style of analog signal, and it won't be of any use at all in receiving modern digital signals. Now, let's set that down here. You may have heard the suggestion that police scanners are illegal. This is an oversimplification. The truth is, it's illegal to use a scanner to help you commit a crime, such as by listening to live police activity to try to avoid being caught. Doing so can lead to additional charges on top of the main crime itself. Also, there are a few states that have restrictions on scanners in vehicles. However, if you are a federally licensed ham radio operator, you are exempt from these restrictions, as the FCC ruled on the issue in 1993. If you live in a restrictive state or travel through one, and you want to be able to use a scanner in your vehicle, this is one of the many good reasons to get a ham radio license. We'll come back to that in a bit. How are we looking here? How does a scanner compare to scanner apps? Okay, so scanner apps, they use those internet feeds that some people voluntarily post. They have a real scanner that is listening over the air, and they hook it up to their computer to live stream what their scanner is picking up. But that live stream, like I say, can be interrupted. It is susceptible to disturbance. If the authorities wanted to shut it down, or if there was an incident electrically, the grid went down, the internet went down, anything like that. Whereas a physical scanner picking up the actual airwaves, first of all, they don't know you're doing it, and second of all, it can't be interrupted. That is not to say, though, that they can't stop using their radio service. If they really want to hide something, they don't want it going out over the air, they switch to cell phones or encrypted radio communications that your scanner won't be able to decrypt. So, something to keep in mind. But especially when all these incidents were going on with the protests and the looting and vandalism, when all that was going on, they really had so much going on that some of the things that they normally might have switched over to cell phones for, they just said out in the air because they were so busy and overwhelmed with everything. So in a real situation like that, these can still be very useful. Let's see here. Okay, good. All right. So, traditional AM and FM receivers, weather radios, crystal radios, shortwave radios, and scanners are all great for receiving information. But what if you want to send a signal to someone else? Well, then you'll need a transmitter. Back in the old days, a receiver and a transmitter were two different units. These days, receivers are common and useful for all the reasons we've already talked about, and one-way transmitters are used for things like remote control, but most of the time, if you want to send a signal, you also want to be able to get one back. If a device is a combination of transmitter and receiver, it's called a transceiver. These allow for two-way radio communications, and for these you've got quite a few options. The old classic is Citizens Band, or CB radio. This uses a band designed for anyone to use without needing any special license, though that wasn't originally the case. CB radio has a well-earned reputation for general disregard of the law. It became hugely popular in the 1970s and into the 80s, before cell phones and the internet, and with millions of people using it, trying to enforce licensing became a difficult waste of resources, so the requirement for a license was dropped in 1983. Even today, CB is technically limited to an output power of 4 watts for a standard AM signal, or 12 watts for single sideband, but people routinely use amplifiers that boost their signal many times beyond this limitation. Originally, CB offered 23 specific frequencies or channels. In 1969, Channel 9 was officially reserved for emergency use only. Unofficially, Channel 19 became a standard for highway communications, so commercial truck drivers could let each other know about things like traffic jams and warn each other about speeding traps. To this day, many CB radios have a dedicated button to go straight to channels 9 and 19. There was also a gap in the frequencies between channels 22 and 23, and some people modified their radios and started using this space for 2 more channels that came to be called 22A and 22B. With the explosion of users causing channels to become overcrowded, CB was expanded to 40 official channels in 1977, and so-called channels 22A and 22B became the new channels 24 and 25. So yes, if you were to arrange the channels by rising frequency, the channels would go 22, 24, 25, 23, 26. Of course, the popularity of CB radio has declined substantially in recent decades. As CB became more crowded, many companies opted to switch over to a different band meant specifically for business. Eventually, cell phones came to dominate and the airwaves cleared up dramatically. That said, CB radio is certainly still in use and still available to you. Let's see, to this day it is still used by some commercial truckers as well as other businesses like construction. You might also hear activity at truck stops where enterprising individuals sometimes use the radio to advertise their services to truckers passing through. There is a substantial hobbyist following as well. If you ever see a pickup truck go by with a pair of matching antennas, those are probably for CB radio. Some people also set up base stations in their home to chat with travelers passing through town. You can find used CB radios at pawn shops, thrift stores, flea markets, and garage sales, as well as online auction sites. This one I got dirt cheap. I think this was from a garage sale. Paid it like $5-10. I also got this one, which this is actually a CB radio. You can do different power options. This battery pack comes off, and you can attach other things. You can hook it up through like the cigarette lighter in your vehicle, and you can take this antenna off, and you can attach it to a cable running to a magnet-mounted antenna on the roof of your vehicle, and operate just like the other rig that I have here. So this, I actually recommend this option because you are able to take it handheld. Just gives you more things you can do. So that is CB. Now, just like a more general shortwave receiver, if you want to have the most options available to you, be sure to get a unit capable of single sideband. And actually, neither of mine are, so that's a thing that I might think about down the road. I do have other priorities before that, but it's a thing. Also, in the traditional CB spirit of lawlessness, you might be curious to research what are called export radios. These are officially sold in the US for ham radio only, but are actually designed specifically for easy modification to enable the unauthorized, illegal use of frequencies outside of the regular CB channels. This practice is called freebanding or outbanding and can interfere with other radio services, including government agencies, and can lead to serious consequences if you are caught. Of course, in the aftermath of a large-scale disaster, enforcement may be unlikely, and freebanding on an export radio could help your transmission to go unnoticed by others who may only have regular CB radios. To be clear, I am not encouraging anyone to break any law, so long as there still is a law. So, let's check the chats here. Any other questions before we proceed? No, looking good. Okay. So just a little review to get our bearings before we move on. There's long wave, and then commercial AM radio, and above that is shortwave. Shortwave is sometimes called HF, which stands for high frequency. But of course, as we said, you can keep going even higher. When you go past HF, you get into VHF and UHF, which stand for very high frequency and ultra high frequency. These are the home of the most common modern radio systems, including commercial FM radio, over-the-air television, public services, private businesses, small electronic device controls, walkie-talkie two-way radios, and of course, more ham radio. One of the most accessible ways to add a simple two-way radio communication system into your preparations is to acquire some walkie-talkies. The Family Radio Service, or FRS, requires no license to use. FRS radios are commonly sold in pairs, though standalone units are available. Interestingly, some dedicated GPS units have a built-in FRS two-way radio in them. I actually have one in our primary bug-out bag. I didn't want to dig it out for this, though. But it's meant to be a GPS unit, but you can also use it as a walkie-talkie. So, it is common for manufacturers to claim, frankly, ridiculous ranges for their radios in the double-digit miles or kilometers. Don't believe them. While these may be technically possible in the most ideal conditions, real-world use of these radios is often limited to a mile or two, maybe more with clear line of sight, no buildings or trees or hills between the two radios. But really, this is for very local communications. You're not going to be talking across the region with any of these. Now, certified FRS radios must meet certain criteria from the FCC, including having an antenna that cannot be detached from the unit, and limiting power to 0.5 watts or 2 watts depending on channel. There are 22 channels available to FRS, and they overlap with another radio service called the General Mobile Radio Service, or GMRS. GMRS requires a license, which is now good for 10 years, it used to be 5 years, and it covers an entire household, so your immediate family members are covered by the same license you get. GMRS allows for more power and more options than FRS. Channels from 15 and above are allowed to operate at up to 50 watts. GMRS equipment can include base stations as well as repeaters. Repeaters can allow two handheld radios that are otherwise too distant from one another to still make contact through the repeater. While until recently it was common to find radios designed to work for both FRS and GMRS, changes to regulations have now restricted combination units. If a device has the capability to exceed FRS limitations, it is now classified strictly as a GMRS device. While FRS and GMRS occupy a segment of spectrum up in the UHF region, there is a somewhat similar service lower down in VHF. This is the Multi-Use Radio Service, or MURS. MURS does not require a special license, and it has a power limit of 2 watts. It's used for both voice and data transmissions, though repeaters are not allowed. While devices such as wireless intercoms often use MURS, and some large companies use MURS two-way radios, they are generally less common than FRS and GMRS to the general public. In the European Union, there is PMR 446, which is a no-licensed UHF service similar to FRS or GMRS. In Australia and New Zealand, there is a roughly equivalent service called UHF-CB. Whichever radio service you use, any of these are an easy way to empower yourself with simple, affordable, two-way radio communications at a local level. So, how are we looking here? Good, good. Oh, what do we have here? Oh, new follower. Hello, Defile. I'm not sure how you say that, sorry. So, you've got your radio, or maybe several different kinds, and you've got all these options open. If disaster strikes, how do you know what frequencies to use? You might try scanning through as many frequencies as possible, but the more you try to scan, the longer it will take to come back around to where you started scanning, and you could miss someone in the meantime. And when do you scan? If you just leave it running any time, that's using up battery power. Some radio operators, with a concern for emergency preparedness, have suggested a coordinated system called the 333 radio plan. It's inspired by an old prepper idea called the rule of threes, which is that you can survive 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without shelter in harsh conditions, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. There are variations on this idea, but the general point is to guide how you prioritize your attention in a survival situation. So, since some preppers already have the number 3 in mind, that's part of the idea behind the 333 radio plan. It goes like this. Whatever kind of radio you have, if it has numbered channels, then in the event of a large-scale disaster, you turn on that radio every 3 hours to channel 3 for 3 minutes to listen for information, calls for help, or to call for help yourself. Use your local time relative to noon at the top of the hour, so 12 p.m., 3 p.m., 6 p.m., and so on. If the accuracy of your clock is in question, allow extra time before and after. If you have a shortwave receiver, you might be able to hear a time code station to synchronize your clock. Also, if you are very near the edge of your time zone, consider operating at the designated times for the neighboring zone in addition to your own. Though remember that doubling your usage also doubles your power consumption. Now, of course, not every radio has a channel 3, so other frequencies may be used. You should familiarize yourself with the type of radio that you're going to use and make note of any frequencies you learn that other people in your area might plan to use in case of emergency. As an extra twist, different manufacturers sometimes designate the same frequencies with different channel numbers. For example, in the GMRS band, Motorola's channel 3 is ICOM's channel 11, while ICOM's channel 3 is Motorola's channel 17. It might be wise to make note of that as well. For example, if you have a matched pair of Motorola walkie-talkies, consider tuning one to channel 3 and the other to channel 17 in case there's someone nearby with an ICOM. Now, the 333 plan has not been formally adopted by any agency, but it's suggested as an informal convention. Despite its shortcomings, should it ever become necessary, it's certainly better than no plan at all. I should also point out here that if you ever want to refer back to anything we've talked about today, you can subscribe to the Prepping Today channel on YouTube and pull up the recording of this episode, which is, of course, episode number 3. So there's that. My CB fell on the floor. Alright, how are we looking here? That is good. What's this here? All right. So, you've gotten a taste for radio, and you want more. You want to be able to hear everything you can. You want to be able to talk to anyone, anywhere in the world. You want the most options available to you. What you want is ham radio. Why is it called ham radio? Well, the real reason is lost to history. There are some plausible explanations, but no one really knows for sure. Officially, ham radio is called amateur radio due to restrictions against commercial use. You can't use the service to make any kind of profit. That said, ham radio operators are often anything but what you'd think of as amateurs, with some possessing vast knowledge and skills that rival any professional radio engineer. But just remember, every single one of them started somewhere, so don't let the wide-open possibilities and ubiquitous technical information scare you off. You can get started in ham radio very, very simply, for very little cost. You don't need to have a lot of expensive equipment, and you don't need to know Morse code. You'll have your whole life to get into however much nitty-gritty you want. Eventually you might end up helping emergency services in a real disaster, or participating in different kinds of contests, or trying to see how far you can reach with as little power as possible, or communicating with other operators through satellites, or talking to astronauts on the International Space Station, or bouncing radio signals off the actual moon. Yes, ham radio operators really do that. But for now, all you need to do is pass a 35-question test, usually for a fee of $15 or less, and then get yourself a $25 handheld radio, and you are officially on the air. In the United States, amateur radio operators are licensed by the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. They will issue you a call sign, which is your unique identity in the world of radio. They currently offer 3 different levels of licensing. The first level is called the technician class. This gives you basic privileges, mostly in the VHF and UHF regions, with some Morse code options down in HF if you're interested to try that. VHF and UHF are mostly fairly local, though you can make use of repeater towers in your area to extend your reach much farther. The next step up is the general class, which is what I am currently. This requires passing another 35-question test and gives you many more options in HF, which really opens up the whole world. With the right gear and the know-how to use it, you can make contacts with people far from your location, even on the other side of the planet. Now, the highest level of license is the amateur extra class. This requires passing a 50-question test and opens up some frequencies available exclusively to extras. There are many free resources online to help you study for the test, including several practice exams, so you can get a real feel for how it will work. Actually, this is a really good way when you're starting out to kind of wrap your brain around how it all works. Just take the test, read a question and sit and think about it, and try to reason out. They're all multiple choice. There's 4 possible answers to each question. And just read through the question and try to imagine what it might be saying, even if you're not familiar with any of the technical aspect. Just try to picture what it's trying to ask, and look at the possible answers and see which of these might intuitively answer that question. A lot of times you'll be right. Other times you'll gain some insight into some technical aspect. So it's something to think about. There are also some good books that help you really understand the why behind the questions, rather than just memorizing the answers. Stick around for more on that. Emergency preparedness is baked into ham radio culture. Every year, the biggest ham radio holiday is called Field Day, when operators around the world take their equipment outside and make sure they can communicate with each other using battery power only. As I said back in the first episode, if the power goes out, if the internet is out, if the phones go down, when all else fails, radio will still work. Can you tell I'm a fan? What do we got here? Okay. Good. Now, the last type of radio I want to mention is not exactly brand new, but it is a major development in recent years and offers many possibilities for the future. Historically, every kind of radio device has done what it does with physical components, hardware. The fancy new thing is software-defined radio, or SDR. This allows you to capture a raw radio signal and then process it any number of ways on a computer, or conversely, to use a computer to generate any kind of signal and then send it out over the air. Basic SDR receiving is extremely accessible with inexpensive devices that you can plug right into your computer's USB port, and free software you can download to use them. It can be an enlightening experience to bring your local commercial radio spectrum up on your screen and watch multiple stations simultaneously as their transmissions sort of pulse up and down. Of course, you can listen to any of them, but then you can also move above and below that chunk of spectrum. Much like a scanner, you can move freely up or down across a broad range of frequencies, but actually seeing the radio spectrum as you go. You might find some ham radio operators chatting on a local repeater. You might see bold digital signals from public service or private businesses. You could see the CB transmissions of truckers passing through town, or FRS transmissions from walkie-talkies. You can pick up signals from weather satellites as they pass overhead and use software to decode their images. You can even see the radio signal the remote lock on your car key fob sends out. You can see Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and near-field communication like RFID. You can see signals from both old-style cordless phones as well as cell phones, and while resources to decode these can be found online, actually doing so is very illegal with serious consequences if you get caught. Most inexpensive SDR devices offer a very wide range of frequencies, though for lower HF frequencies you may need another device called an up converter. These receive lower frequencies and convert them upward into a range your SDR device can understand. There are also devices that enable you to transmit, though these can get quite expensive, and of course you'll need a ham radio license to use them. Good. Now, let's talk safety and security. There are a few things to keep in mind here. First of all, just remember, anything you transmit goes out into the world, and anyone with the right equipment can hear it. You don't know who might be listening. Be careful what you talk about. Some radios offer a so-called privacy feature, where you can set a special code that you coordinate with someone else, so only the two of you can talk to each other. However, what this actually means is no one else can talk to you without using the right code, but anyone can still hear you. They can try to use their radio to talk to you, but if their signal doesn't send the right code with it, your radio won't turn on. That's all this kind of privacy feature does. It doesn't keep your conversations private, it just keeps people from butting in. Also, there are a limited number of codes to use, and it isn't too hard for someone to figure out which one you're using. If they have a set of 2 radios, they set one to listen with no code, and they can hear you on that one every time you transmit. And then they set the other radio with a code. If only the first radio hears you, then they set the second radio to the next code, and so on, until eventually both radios can hear you. Then they know which code you're using, and they can interrupt your communications. Now, of course, the stereotypical prepper has a reputation for being paranoid. There are certainly some who are interested in ham radio, but don't want to take the test to get an operator license because they don't trust the government, thinking that agents might come to confiscate their equipment to silence them or suppress information. Personally, I don't find that scenario especially plausible, but sure, I suppose there's a distant chance it could happen. The idea is that in a large-scale disaster, licensing won't matter. Even now, in normal times, anyone is free to use any frequency they can to call for help if it's a matter of life or death. To me, though, the bigger concern with getting a ham radio license is the fact that it's a matter of public record, which includes your name and address. Anyone can search a call sign to find who it belongs to. That's why I haven't mentioned my call sign here, and I won't get it on my license plate, as many operators do. You can get a post office box and use that as your address, which is a fairly common thing to do, but you need to be sure to maintain that P.O. box, because if the FCC ever tries to send you mail and it can't be delivered, your license can be suspended or revoked. I do think it's important to get a ham radio license, though. Quite simply, you need to practice. You need to use your gear and become familiar with it, and while you don't need a license to listen, you will want to transmit to understand the capabilities of your equipment, how far it reaches, in what conditions, whether you should upgrade your antenna, are you going to need more power, and so on. If you transmit without a license, you are very easy to track down. Licensed operators make a game of it. Radio direction finding to locate a transmitter is called a fox hunt. There are harsh penalties when you get caught. If you want to use ham radio frequencies, please do it the right way and get a license. All right. Now, to close this out before we move on to this week's news, I want to make just a quick digression. When I said that radio really is a rainbow, I really meant it, even if it isn't a rainbow we can see. If you start with a radio wave and then move into higher and higher frequencies, eventually those waves in the electromagnetic field start to interact with matter differently. The upper end of radio frequencies lead into microwaves, the type of waves your microwave oven uses to heat up your food. And you can keep going with higher and higher frequencies, and you pass through infrared into visible light. That's right. All the light you can see and every single color you can perceive is just a tiny sliver of the full electromagnetic spectrum. The rod and cone cells in the retina in the back of your eye are like tiny antennas, detecting the waves of the electromagnetic field tuned to their own specific frequencies. And you can still keep going, and you get into ultraviolet, then X-rays, and then gamma rays. All of these are the very same thing, just different size waves in the electromagnetic field of the universe. Seriously, get yourself a ham radio license. Let's have a pool party. How are we looking here? All right, let's get to the news. So, Russia has granted regulatory approval to a vaccine against SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. However, this vaccine, named Sputnik V, has not completed human trials for safety or efficacy. Experts worldwide are skeptical of the claimed 2-year immunity and remain concerned about possible side effects of the vaccine. Many suspect the approval was rushed simply so Russia can claim to be the first with a vaccine. This perspective led Russia's own leading respiratory doctor to quit the Russian Health Ministry's Ethics Council, citing gross violations of medical ethics. New Zealand has reported 14 new cases of COVID-19, ending a streak of 102 days without any new cases at all. A 3-day lockdown has been imposed on the city of Auckland, while the confirmed cases and other people they've been in contact with will be quarantined. The United Kingdom is officially in recession for the first time in 11 years. Nearly 750,000 jobs have been lost in the UK since March, and the economy shrank 20.4% between April and June, the single largest quarterly drop on record. This mirrors the worst ever 32.9% drop in GDP in the United States for the same period. It's been a great week. How are we looking here? Good. All right, so let's get to the recommendations. This week's gear recommendation is a handheld ham radio transceiver. There are many options available, but the most popular are variations on the Baofeng UV5R. That's BAOFENG UV-5R. There is an entire family of related radios from Baofeng as well as Pofeng and B-Tech and others with somewhat different capabilities. This one is actually a B-Tech. This is my favorite of the kinds of these that I have. Most transmit with 5 watts of power, though some models can do 7 or 8. This gives them a little more capability to send signals farther more clearly, but they aren't any better at getting reception. Most are dual band in VHF and UHF, working in both the 2-meter band at 144 MHz and the 70 centimeter band around 440 MHz, though there are some 3-band radios capable of also using the 1.25 meter band at 220 MHz. This kind is a tri-band, a 3-band radio. That's one of the reasons it's my favorite. Let's see. Most use analog FM, though some are capable of digital mobile radio or DMR. I don't actually have one of those. It's interesting from a technological perspective, but I don't see it being a lot of use in a prepping sense. DMR, the systems that it relies on the internet, and having an ID number, it doesn't seem like if you're concerned about a grid down situation where that's going to be a thing you're going to want to deal with or be able to deal with. So the analog FM of this kind of radio is really what I'd focus on. With the current state of the market, the most basic models can be found new for around $25. These are 5-watt dual-band analog FM radios. If you are able to spend a little more, in my opinion, your best bet is a 3-band version, which are currently around $45. There are many accessories available for these radios. Let's see. They often interchange between different versions, though not always. So when you end up with several different kinds of this radio like I have, you can swap the batteries and all that back and forth. So the very first accessory I'd recommend is a longer antenna. The stock antenna on this kind of radio, this is called a rubber duck or a rubber ducky. They're fine, but these are better, much better. You can also get, this is the standard battery that comes in the radio, but you can also get extended batteries that have more capacity. You can also get some that look like this. They have the same form factor, but they split open, and you can fill them with AA batteries. If you're using full power AA batteries, non-rechargeable, you should actually fill one slot with a spacer that isn't a live battery. Otherwise, the total voltage can add up and fry the radio. But if you're using rechargeable cells, you can just fill it all up with the rechargeable cells. Rechargeables nominally operate at 1.2 volts each, whereas regular non-rechargeable AA batteries operate at 1.5 volts. And so when you add those up, it has the potential to fry your radio. So just use a spacer if you're using non-rechargeable batteries. You can also get adapters that take the place of the battery on the radio. They plug in where the battery normally would go, but then the other end you plug it into the cigarette lighter in your vehicle. You can also, like with the handheld CB radio I have, you can also attach a magnet mount antenna that goes on the roof of your vehicle to one of these. You can get connectors that have this style of, I just dropped my CB on the floor, that have this kind of speaker, so you don't have the transmitter right up against your head when you're trying to talk into it. There is some concern with RF exposure and safety on that, so there's tons of options to consider, and you can spend as much money on these as you want. So you can program these radios easily using a free application called Chirp, so you can store the frequencies and access tones for your local repeaters. It's worth noting that Chirp can also expand the frequency range on some of these radios, though of course it is illegal to transmit outside of the official bands. These radios are also fully capable of operating on the same frequencies as FRS, GMRS, and MURS, though again, these radios are not certified for use on those services. You can, of course, get one of these radios before you officially have a ham radio license, so you can practice receiving and to program it with your local repeater information, but of course you cannot transmit until you are licensed. It's worth mentioning that some ham radio operators are not fans of these radios, having a reputation for being cheap Chinese junk. If these other operators know that you're using this kind of radio, if they're this kind of operator, they might claim your signal is weak or noisy. However, they might make the same claim if you're using a more expensive radio and you just tell them it's a Bofeng. Or conversely, if you're actually using a Bofeng but you claim to be using a Kenwood or Yaesu or ICOM, they might say you're coming in loud and clear. Don't let this kind of person bring you down just because they spent 10 or 100 times more money on their rig. What your radio can do for you is what matters. Of course, you could make the big investment in one of the bigger brand names, in which case I would still recommend a handheld transceiver or HT, rather than a base station unit or one mounted in your vehicle. Those are both good options, but if you only have one radio, I think it's good to be able to grab it and go wherever you may need to. Plus, they pack well in a bug-out bag. If you do pack it away for a while, though, I'd recommend keeping the battery out of it and periodically making sure it's charged up. So, good. Oh, what do we got here? Oh, nice. Thank you. Now, the book for this week is down here. The book I'm recommending this week is the ARRL Ham Radio License Manual. As it says on the cover, this is all you need to become an amateur radio operator. The ARRL is the American Radio Relay League, a non-profit organization for ham radio operators in the United States. This book is pretty much the standard for getting started in the world of ham radio. It will help you study for the test to get the basic technician class license, and to really understand the concepts behind the questions rather than just memorize the answers. This is actually an old edition. You want to be sure to get the latest because the questions for the test get updated every 4 years. You could use an older edition if you find a cheap used copy. It would help you to learn, but you should then also look up what has changed since then. For example, between this 3rd edition and the current 4th edition, about a quarter of the questions on the test are different. There are other good resources for beginners, And I will actually give an honorable mention this week to Ham Radio for Dummies, just because this one also does a pretty good job of explaining what ham radio is all about and helps you understand the underlying concepts. So, all right, how we doing? Last call. Looks good. All right, so that's our show. I hope you all found it useful or at least entertaining. If you did, please consider joining our Patreon to support the show. That's patreon.com/preppingtoday. I've got some rewards posted there now, but let me know if you have any ideas for others. You can email me at preppingtoday@protonmail.com or find me on Twitter. That's @prepping_today. I'll be back next week. I have been your host, Prepper J, and now more than ever, get prepping today. Thank you very much for watching. Stay safe and healthy out there. Keep the lights on.